Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us again on Network X. Tonight, Network X is quite proud and honored to have here in the studio Vandana Shiva. Vandana is the recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, termed by some the Alternative or the Environmental Nobel Prize, director of the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Natural Resource Policy in Dehradun, India. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes.
And author of numerous articles and books, including the much-acclaimed Staying Alive, Women, Ecology, and Development, and the Violence of the Green Revolution. Active in citizens' movements in India against environmental destruction, Vandana is also a member of the National Environmental Council of India and the director of Navdanya, a seed conservation project. She has also served on numerous international advisory bodies, including UNEP's Panel 4 on Biosafety, and currently sits on the advisory board and the boards of directors of many U.S. organizations, including the Earth Island Institute. Thank you for joining us this evening on Network X.
Pleasure to be here with you.
Could I start by asking what brings you to Seattle, Washington?
Well, I was in San Francisco and am on my way to Canada, and I thought I would meet up with friends in Seattle to work on issues of common concern, issues of biodiversity, intellectual property rights, especially since the new threats around the patenting of life, which is an ethical threat, and around the piracy of third world biological wealth, which is an economic and social justice threat, are threats arising from the dominant thinking of this country. At one level, the biggest problem in the new world order, the world order of free trade, is really the thinking that dominates Washington and the rest of this country. And therefore, if we have to solve our problems at home, I have to very often try and deal with the roots of the problem very far away.
And so it brings you to the United States. I know India, perhaps more than many other countries, has truly responded with alarm. Is that perhaps because these new international trade agreements, this new way of thinking, as you might call it, is impacting India more so than many other countries?
I don't think so. I think the United States is also desperately impacted. I think the levels of people being thrown out of work as a result of the freedom for capital to move where it wants without any accountability is something that is hurting the citizens of this country too. I think this country is just more colonized mentally. The citizens are more colonized.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is they're willing to take the rhetoric of the dominant interests as their own with far more gullibility. Their minds have been taken over. And I think if there has been more resistance from India, it is not just India will hurt more than other countries. It will hurt a lot because India has a lot of poverty. And I think the poor are the ones who will be most sacrificed. But it is also the case that there will be a creation of new poverty. We can already see it, what we saw in the streets of France, with the workers reacting to being laid off through the privatization that's part of this new globalization. They were resisting becoming the new poor. And it's not happening enough, in my view, in the United States, the resistance of the new poor to a system that is making them poor.
We were actually just talking about that before you came into the studio. It seems that the French, in their response to their government's actions, basically are responding to what is almost the equivalent of this contract with America, that majority of the Americans are going to be negatively impacted by, and in our case, the Americans are doing nothing. In the case of the French, they've literally shut down the entire nation.
And not just shut down the entire nation, actually got a lot of policies withdrawn by the really large, broad-based solidarity between workers and the youth and ordinary citizens. The commuters were not going to turn against the transport workers just because they were not getting to office quickly enough. They realized that tomorrow it could be their turn, and they had better stand with those who are being thrown out today. And the dispensability of people is really, in a way, the ethos of the new globalization. And even though India is much more, has more poor people, I think India's democratic spirit, in a strange kind of way, is more alive, where people refuse to be made victims of deliberate policy. They can be activated far more on issues of justice.
You speak of, what was the term you used,
Dispensability.
The dispensability of people. There would almost be inherent in that then the sense that perhaps India is a bit more humane, a bit more civilized. They have a greater concern for life?
I definitely think so. I definitely think that India is a more humane society in terms of recognizing where you have to draw the line between inhumane policy. And people react, people say no. People are more alert. People turn out in larger numbers for elections than they do in this country. And as far as the GATT issue is concerned, I've worked in the cities, I've worked with the intelligentsia, and I've worked with rural communities. And I can say that it is quicker and easier to make the poor in the rural areas understand what free trade is about, what intellectual property rights are about, than the educated elite of Delhi.
Why do you think that's the case?
I think it comes back to the issue of the colonized mind. I think so much of the elite of Delhi thinks so much in terms of mobile capital means we might have a little bit of share in that mobility. We might be able to get rich faster. We might have 3 cars instead of 2. They can dream those dreams. The poor in the countryside don't have false dreams to dream. They know when their land gets taken away for shrimp farms, for exporting shrimp to rich consumers in the north, that's the end of their survival and the future of their children. They know when land reform, which has guaranteed that no one can have land ownership beyond a certain amount in India, which is quite low. It's as low as 20 acres in irrigated areas, and it has been a part of our public policy for ensuring that as many people have a right to land as possible. When that is getting undone, and corporations are being allowed to own as much as they can, and agribusiness starts to come in to plant flowers, as they do in Latin America, the peasants know that's the end of their future, so they fight.
So it's much more a survival issue.
It is very, very clearly a survival issue. And one of the major things that's happening as a result of this direct attack through globalization and free trade on the very survival of people is new forms of politics is emerging, new forms of democracy is emerging, where people are finding absolutely new ways to say no to the theft of their resources.
You know, it's very interesting. Quite often, especially when you travel with these discussions in intellectual circles, the experts are drawn out and we're told, well, you know, it's not that simple. You know, these are very complex issues. Yet it seems when you go to the poor people, I would assume, you know, people who aren't as well educated, you probably explain these things very simply to them. So the things some of these things that we're told are so complex are probably very simple.
I agree with you. For instance, take the intellectual property rights debate in GATT. The term intellectual property rights itself is meant to confuse and mystify. It's a nonsensical term that should mean nothing. Intellectual property rights? You know, property was intangible goods. Intellectual property is a concoction of the last decade, literally. You had industrial property. Industrial property was around artifacts, inventions that were hardware and mechanical and electrical. But suddenly turning it into products of the mind and making products of the mind equivalent to, you know, to making plants and animals and microbes and human cell lines defined as products of the human mind, there's absolute, you know, I mean, an absolute lie behind this construction. But within the elite, the intelligentsia, there is an attempt to engage in this to not look stupid. When you go to the villages, at least when I took the IPR issue to the villages and I said, you know, your seeds are going to be, I mean, you will very soon be in the situation of American farmers who have to buy seeds from companies, who no more call seed their own, and who every year have to pay 80% royalties, even for seeds saved, who get treated as criminals for exchanging seeds with their neighbors. Or would you accept such a system? And instantly, the reply is, but seed is not made by any intellectual's mind, not even ours. And we have intellects too. So instantly the debate moves into nature's role in evolution, into the gift of nature in terms of the diversity of crops and seed varieties, into the role of farmers as intelligent human beings who have evolved the seed variety we have in the world today, which the seed industry uses, and into the issue of monopolies, control over our crop diversity by a handful of corporations. Take the case of one company, W.R. Grace, which I became familiar with because of the fact that it was starting to buy up all the patents on a pesticide from a native Indian tree called the neem. A wonderful tree for controlling pests. And Grace has many of the patents to biopesticide from this tree in the last few years.
This is a natural pesticide made from the tree.
It's a natural pesticide made from the tree. It's not made synthetically by Grace's labs. Interestingly, a subsidiary of this same company has broad patents on all genetic modification of soybean, which means any genetically modified soybean in future will be their property, and anyone planting soybean will have to pay royalties to them. Cotton, any genetic modification of cotton, they have a monopoly claim to it. They have a monopoly claim to embryo transfer in all mammals, which includes cows, but it also includes human beings in the future if we don't draw ethical boundaries. So what we have is individual corporations controlling all of the future, all of reproduction, all of plant, human, and animal life. I think the situation is too precarious and too vulnerable when that kind of concentrated power takes hold of not just society and the economy, but nature itself.
Well, I think to the average person, I think the immediate response to that would be, well, that just obviously can't be. That's that. I mean, not even worth talking about. It's just, you're wrong. You must be crazy. Let's take a step back on this, partially because I'm a little green on this one myself. You talked about this new way of thinking, specifically around intellectual property rights, the whole definition of intellectual property as something that can be owned and patented. It's going back to just being created about 10 years ago. Talk about that if you can. How did this get created, and how did it get so far astray?
Well, like I said, intellectual property, that phrase is really not more than 1.5 decades old. Before that, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we did have industrial property around invention of mechanical devices. Clear artifacts which are made by an individual. You can see what it is. You can see what the contribution of the individual is. There's no confusion about that innovation. And the beginning of that really was with the first patent given to a device by the Republic of Venice in something like the 15th century. The term patent goes even further back. Patents are the most dominant form of intellectual property rights. And the term patent, interestingly, goes back to the history of colonization. The pieces of paper that people like Columbus received from the sovereigns of Spain to sail out and conquer any land and take it over, that little piece of paper used to be called a letter patent. The letter patent authorized the merchant adventurers of that period to set sail on behalf of the kings and queens of Europe, who were acting on behalf of God himself because they had the divine right of kings and queens. And under that divine right, they would hand over these letters patent. And the letters patent said, go and find any territory anywhere in the world, and if it is not occupied by white European Christians, declare it as ours and improve on it and bring back the wealth from it. That is how America was discovered by Columbus.
So I'm hearing that basically nothing has really changed.
It has gone worse because in Columbus's time, what was discovered was land, territory that belonged to other peoples, and what was made invisible were the people themselves. What is now being discovered is literally all of life, all of evolution, biodiversity, all living things. It's going much further than the earth and the land. It's going literally into all the diversity of life. And what is being rendered invisible is not just the rights of prior people, of the original inhabitants of the land, but what is being rendered invisible is the evolutionary contribution of nature, for instance, to have properties in trees like the neem, to give you a principle called the azadirachtin principle, which controls pests, and to pretend that it has been created out of the minds of people in Western labs. And the second thing that's being made invisible is the entire history, culture, and intellectual heritage of diverse cultures across the world, whose heritage is being grabbed. And like America was colonized, on the pretext that it was a discovery of a continent, the heritage and biological and intellectual heritage of entire cultures around the world is being colonized on grounds that it has been, it's an invention.
Well, how does a company like Cargill, say? Cargill is a major, probably one of the largest supplier of seeds and I think fertilizers in the world. Yeah. It's based, I think, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I used to live there, and it's the only way I remember its name. How does, say, Cargill wind up owning the patent, that for a seed that an Indian farmer has essentially not created, but essentially has raised and adapted for centuries? Now, how does the Cargill wind up owning that patent, and how now does that farmer suddenly have to pay Cargill to use that seed?
Well, I'd like to clarify that so far in India, we have managed to block the introduction of any of these intellectual property rights regimes through the movements and through parliamentary debates and through democratic process. So we are not in a situation where Indian farmers are having to pay royalties.
But other countries are.
But the American farmers are paying royalties to the Cargills. And the phenomena works this way. Cargill was a nobody. It was a small firm, a small family firm. It's the largest American private corporation. And it's literally in the 70s that it became a major, major grain trader through grain sales, violating the embargo.
I think there were grain sales to Russia.
Exactly. That was its big deal. And then, since then, they have learned to find ways to control more and more of the food system without investing anyway in actual food production. By controlling, on the one hand, the trade, the actual transport of grain, by controlling the commodity trade, the bidding in futures in Chicago, London, and by controlling the inputs, the chemicals, the fertilizers, the seeds, increasingly. Cargill had no interest in seeds till a few years ago. It is now the 10th largest seed business. The Indian farmers' most important actions against GATT and the free trade treaties was against Cargill. And it was not an accident. Cargill had entered India in 1988 when, under a World Bank structural adjustment program, India was forced to allow multinational corporations to enter in the seed sector. Cargill refused to subject itself to the Indian criteria that every company bringing in seed from outside had to hand over some for quarantine protection. When you walk into the States, there's such strict quarantine procedures. The Indian plant genetic resources system also wanted to be sure that the seeds that are introduced are free of disease, don't introduce new pests. Cargill just absolutely refused to contribute seeds to our plant genetic resources system and our quarantine system, saying it was a violation of their intellectual property rights. That if our research stations had access to this seed, they were going to be able to figure out what was the genetic material in the seed. Interestingly, Cargill has never produced it. It's up in a snowbound region. Its headquarters, like you said, is in Minneapolis. But it dominates all the core corn, all the sorghum, all the wheat production in the world increasingly. In India, its seed introduction was a big disaster because it introduced sunflower seeds that instead of yielding the promised 15 quintals per hectare, yielded 2, 3, 4 quintals per hectare. And the Indian farmers were so mad, not just about the failure of the seed, but about the demand for monopoly rights that Cargill had, that they literally tore down the Cargill offices, physically just broke down the seed plant. The seeds that Cargill is selling back to the farmers have come from some other third world farmers' fields. They are then picked up from what are called the ex-situ gene banks, where all these collections are held. The majority of these gene banks are under the control of the industrialized world. The farmers who have given seeds to these gene banks do not have access to their own seed. Corporations have absolutely free access to the genetic material in the seed banks. So they can walk in, get any seed they need, mix and match around, tinker it a little bit, take the drought resistance from one farmer's seed, the protein content from another farmer's seed, mix it together and sell it back to farmers as if it was literally like a mechanical artifact to which they had given rise to because of their brilliance. I have seen the detailed processes through which they work, for instance, in seed production, and farmers who they sign, first of all, they don't sign contracts directly with farmers for seed production. They sign contracts with an individual who will then basically control 300 producers of seed. Part of what this individual has to police and regiment is that no farmer exchanges seed. Seed exchange is being a part of farmers' heritage everywhere in the world, including in living memory in the United States. That free exchange is blocked because these corporations want to have total monopoly control on genetic material which they have claimed to be their property, which is not their property.
So you're saying basically all they've done is figured out the makeup of these particular seeds. They've found the genetic code or whatever, and they've essentially
Well, it's not that they've figured out. The farmers know which is a drought-resistant seed. The farmers know which seed resists which pest. I'm running a major conservation program in India for the conservation of native varieties of crops. And farmers know exactly what they have. They know what are the characteristics, what are the properties. They might not state it in genetic language, but the descriptions of their crops, there's a jhumkia, a rice variety in my region, which basically says it's so heavy that it droops. There's millet names that tell you exactly which one is a milky millet, very high in calcium content. There's the most famous rice in the world that you must be eating in Indian restaurant is called basmati. Basmati comes from my valley, Doon Valley. It's the best place for growing basmati. Basmati basically means the rice that has a wonderful smell. The name tells you that, and the farmers haven't been fools. They have evolved crop varieties. They have bred crop varieties with intellectual contribution, recognizing which varieties they need for which ecological condition, for what cultural requirement, and for which economic need. So there has been a breeding process in which farmers have engaged, except that this breeding process has been aimed at sustainability, diversity, and need. It has not been aimed at non-sustainability, uniformity, and greed.
Now, what's allowing Cargill to claim ownership over these varieties?
A very, very perverted intellectual property rights system. The breeders' rights system that the seed companies have put in place, and it was just a handful of 5 countries that signed the breeders' rights system, which is called UPOV, the Undertaking on Plant Varieties.
Which countries?
It was definitely the US, France, England, and I can't remember off my head the rest, but it was just 5 countries sat together and said, okay, we will have a breeders' rights system, which will be UPOV. And they defined what are breeders' rights. That very definition of breeders' rights defined away the largest number of breeders in the world, which is the farmers.
So is it just then their large control of the world economic market that then allows them to force this on every other country?
To define legal systems in ways that only work for them.
And
it
that's
is the economic power that allows them to shape laws, to shape institutions in ways that work to increase the economic power while eroding the economic base of the farmers of the world.
So the more things change, the more they remain the same, as you say, get worse.
They get worse. And my dream really is, we have started ever since the GATT Treaty was imposed around the world, we started what we call a seed satyagraha. Satyagraha is a very Gandhian term. Sat is truth. Agraha is the struggle. Satyagraha is a struggle for truth. It's our way of doing politics a politics of justice, doing a politics of sustainability. And every time there is deep violation, we have satyagraha. So when the British wanted to monopolize salt production, so all the revenues from salt would go and finance their armies, Gandhi walked to a beach and picked up the salt and said, this is gifted to us free from the ocean. We will not allow it to become a monopoly. That was the salt satyagraha, the very famous salt satyagraha of 1930 that triggered the independence movement onto a scale that was uncontrollable, led to our freedom. We started a seed satyagraha in 1991. In a similar way, farmers picked up seed and said, seed is a gift of nature. We have worked with nature to evolve varieties that suit us. This seed legacy will never be alienated from the farmers. And we are committed to that. And my dream is to be able to bring Indian farmers to the United States and do a seed satyagraha with American farmers against the monopolies of the seed corporations in this country.
You know, it's interesting in the numerous people that we've interviewed on our show in the past couple of years, a lot of it seems to be coming back. We say, well, what can we do to help you? What can we do to help you? You know, can we come there? Can we do something for you there? They say, no, your work is right here, because right here is where most of this evil originates from. And tonight here I'm hearing almost the same from you. So you've come to Seattle to perhaps share some of this with some of our colonialized minds?
Not the colonialist mind, it's really friends who feel the solidarity, and to work a little more at removing the powerlessness of American citizens.
Where do you think that powerlessness lies?
I think it lies in the mythology that's been created, in the propaganda that allows citizens to believe that they are living in the biggest democracy, the most free-loving nation in the country, even while the U.S. citizens are less free to act, to design their lives as they would than many other cultures. And I think the other, I mean, if I'm talking about looking at it from a distance right now, the entire debate that's going on and absolutely breaking down your government functioning around your budget, it makes it look like the whole issue of financing is an issue of government. You know, how big or fat or thin or lean a government is. But the issue of financing is also how much the large corporations undermine the wealth of society, how much the large corporations take away livelihoods and employment and jobs where wealth gets created, or how much they run away from being taxed and returning to society what they have taken from it. And the focus is totally on government. There is no focus on corporations in the mind of the American public. And I think that the fact that the American citizen is more dominated by the corporation than by the government, one would have thought that citizen politics around corporate domination is where freedom would be sought.
Well, why do you think that isn't the case? Why do you think people aren't trying to seek it there? You think they just they're just not getting that?
I think part of it is the power of the media to lull people into believing that the demon is the state only, yeah. The demon is the state. Don't look at the corporations. Forget the corporations. We'll run your life and we will witch hunt government. I mean, you can't have absence of governance. You know, there's always been governance of one form or the other, and this fiction that is being created, that free trade will mean no government, a new world order will mean no government, is crazy, because even the very people who are doing the propaganda to say, shed so many jobs, shut up this department, close down this unit of technology assessment, that's the one I really thought, you know, you live in a technological world with new technologies emerging on the horizon, and the first thing you do is don't allow society to assess what those technologies will do to society. It's an absolute blind alley. Interestingly, the very same forces that are doing this propaganda and really bashing of welfare, budget spending, are the forces that require a very strong state to manage the system they're putting in place. For instance, the system of intellectual property rights. You cannot manage a system of intellectual property rights without a very heavy policing system. There are already intellectual property rights police functioning.
Right, but they're not being ruled by a state. Isn't it true that GATT and NAFTA accords and the governing bodies that will administer them are extraterritorial or extra-national?
The bodies that determine are extraterritorial, but the instrumentalities through which they oppress citizens in individual domestic countries will also involve the machinery of governments of that system. You know, if the software, for instance, if the software IPRs become more rigid, it will be your police system that will step into your offices to figure out whether the software you're using was pirated or bought. I was just reading in France, some horticulture, the horticulture firm has an IPR detective to go around and check whether the plantings are from a protected variety of a horticultural plant or not. And so you're going to get increasingly that kind of policing state, but not just for intellectual property rights. When you disenfranchise 80% of the population of every country, when you dispense with the rights and the liberties of 80%, that you are definitely going to have law and order problems. There will be dissent. You will therefore have to have larger law and order machinery. So it is not the case that this new era of the free market will really get rid of state systems. It's just that it's going to turn state systems into one-sided systems. One-sided systems that don't work on behalf of citizens, work only on behalf of corporations, that don't work to provide peaceful, secure community life to citizens, but to provide security and protection to corporate property. We can't have societies like that. They're non-sustainable. It can't work over time. It will collapse.
And so it seems that it's going to be the American people that are going to be the only thing that are going to be stand between that happening or not. So, since you've come here, what are you going to be telling Americans tomorrow night?
Well, I hope to share with people I will be talking to my sense of what is a real struggle for freedom in this era of free trade, and my sense of the responsibilities of those who are in more affluent situations today to those who are not. The relationship is definitely not one of charity, nor is it one of condescension. It is one of responsibility and compassion.
Well, we here at Network X, we work pretty hard to try and get information out to people, but as you can imagine, what we're up against is not the information we're going to get them, but, you know, maybe one time a week for that half hour. But we're going against the information that they're bombarded with day after day, you know, on virtually every channel and you know, virtually from every source of media or propaganda that comes our way. What tips do you have for us in dealing with the colonized mind that's being fed such large doses of that sort of thing?
Well, I think there's only a certain kind of situation within which that kind of colonization of the mind through the media can work. If you are not able to see the future of your children with security. No amount of propaganda that this is the beautiful American dream is going to work for too long. If you're feeling the pinch in terms of losing your job with total lack of predictability, no matter how high the level of your employment, you're not going to be fooled into believing that there's just an upward climb for everyone in American society. And I think this new reality of the dispensability of even the privileged American population is a moment in history where even small amounts of communication that give some clearer picture to the public about why is this happening, some coherent idea about the structures at work that are not in their benefit as they are not in the interests of citizens in any other country. I think it can be in tiny amounts, but if it is the right kind of message, it resonates. Otherwise, we would never have seen change happen in the past in human history either.
We're going to close on that note. And I think tonight we're giving our viewers on Network X that kind of information. And I thank you for being here to do that with us.